Hey, what's up, everybody? Thanks for tuning in to episode number 41 of the White Knuckle podcast, powered by Ozonics. Undetectable, undeniable. Well, hey, everybody. Thanks again for listening in to the White Knuckle podcast, powered by Ozonics. I can't believe it's 41 episodes since we started this whole endeavor. It's been a ton of fun along the way, and we thank each and every one of you for tuning in weekly. I just wanted to remind everyone, as a loyal listener of this podcast, you're entitled to a discount from Ozonics on the HR 300 or HR 200. Right now, they've got the HR 300 on sale for $399, so our code wouldn't do you a whole lot better than that. That's a steal. So I just wanted to remind everyone before we kick the show off that Ozonics is running an incredible special on that HR 300 for $399 till, I guess, till supplies are gone. So it says all over the place that it's a limited time offer. We have no idea when it ends. We just know it's a great deal right now and wanted to make you aware. With that, let's get the show started. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the White Knuckle podcast. Today, of course, Todd Pringnitz, my co-host, is with me, and we are joined today by a couple of guys that really have lived a large part of their life studying deer. They both work for Mississippi State in the Deer Lab. One is a voice that will be familiar to you, and that's Bronson Strickland. He's been on the show a couple times. And the other would be his partner in crime, so to speak, Steve Demarais. Hey, guys, how are you doing this morning?
Doing wonderful. Glad to be on the podcast again.
Yeah. Hey, Jason and Todd. Steve Demarais here. Great to be with you.
Well, guys, time we had Bronson on the podcast, I learned a lot, and I always find it very, very interesting talking with biologists because you guys know the real science behind all the, excuse my French, BS basically that we hear that's inundated throughout the industry and through Facebook and all the tweets and messaging and all that other stuff. Sometimes I think it's just you get a little inundated. I know I do too, and sometimes you don't know who to listen to. So I trust you guys. You know what you're doing. This is what you do for a living. So it's always a pleasure, and thank you guys for joining us this morning.
Well, Todd, let me say this, Todd. Sometimes it's good to listen to BS because that's my initial.
Oh, my gosh.
Well, you couldn't have set that one up.
Oh, my.
Better,
Did you guys talk before this?
Jason?
Well, you might imagine I've gotten that a few times in my life.
Well, Steve, if you could tell us just a little bit about yourself. I know that you're a co-director. Am I correct in the MSU Deer Lab?
Yeah. The Deer Lab is really kind of a conceptual thing. It's who we are and what we do here at Mississippi State University. And Bronson and I share that responsibility. It's great to work with Bronson because he's kind of the face, the eye candy of our partnership, and then
I know that feeling.
I'm more the.
Oh yeah.
I'm more in the grass and like to work with details, concepts and things. But I've been doing this for almost 40 years, over 35 years. Born and raised in New England and hunted deer there, and came south with a passion for deer, and I've been blessed to get my master's and PhD in deer-related research, and spent 15 years in Texas as a big game specialist out there for 2 different universities, and then came to Mississippi State in 97 and been loving it ever since.
Well, we're pleased to have both of you on today, and it's a privilege just to get to have 2 people in the room, so to speak, that know so much about deer. We're going to talk about a topic that you guys just got done doing a podcast on, and that's the rut. And first, let me open the show by saying, in my opinion, and I don't know whether y'all share it or not, and Todd, whether he shares it or not, I don't know, but we'll find out here shortly. The rut is really a broad term because it's sort of a year-long process, is it not?
Steve, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. The rut, to me, has to be defined specifically whenever you're talking about it. And for me, the rut I try to tell people there's the buck rut, which is a potential rut, and it takes place from basically the point where hardened antlers occur. You know, they shed their velvet, and that behavior associated with the potential rut by the buck starts in the causing behavioral changes due to the increase in testosterone, which happens in late summer. So it's really a potential rut. I think of it as the buck is capable of breeding and acting like he wants to breed from that point of velvet shedding, which here in Mississippi is anywhere from late September to early October, and all the way through when he sheds his antlers in February, typically in Mississippi. So it's kind of that potential rut for him. And then from the female side, you know, there's individually, an individual female is going to be in the rut in breeding condition for, you know, a couple of days. And then within the population of females, there's going to be about a 5-week period that breeding takes place primarily. About 90% of the breeding takes place. And that when that female breeding population event is happening varies with region of the United States.
And one of the things I'd like to add to this particular point is I've watched it long enough through all my different hunting seasons and all that, but just because you see a young buck go run around horny, you know, in a morning hunt or an evening hunt, it doesn't mean the rut's going on. That's just an immature animal that is overly excited for things that are to come. And what I've observed is as you get into the older population, you get into 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old deer, they get settled way down. They don't get too excited until they know they're getting close to when the females start to come into heat. The other thing, too, Sam Clora, who owns Mrs. Dopey, is a friend of ours. He lives just down the road from me. He raises deer for his Dopey operation and all that. And he's always a great person to talk to because his deer that are in the fence, they still act like natural deer as far as their breeding cycle goes. Mm-hmm. And he's always made a joke to me. He said, you know, we have guys who come in here. He owns an archery shop there, so he has guys coming and going throughout the season. And you know, every guy, you got some guys, you know, there's nothing going on. You talk to the next guy, holy cow, they're running like crazy. And the way he put it to me, he said, the does come into heat virtually within a day or two and leave the breeding cycle within a day or two every single year. He said a lot of the biggest thing you're noticing is just nighttime movement versus daytime movement, which has something to do with the moon phase, which I'm not real educated with, but a lot of it's just temperature related. You guys want to tip into that? Basically, he said he has about a 2-week period where all of his does will come into heat, get bred, and then they're done. Now, some will come back into heat later on, but I think a lot of this extended rut and early rut and all this stuff is all a human thing that has been created to excuse why we aren't seeing anything. Isn't that the case?
Love your generalizations there, and I'll agree with some and poke holes in others, but
okay.
Yeah, I think I've noticed in our deer research facility that females tend to have a time when they come into estrus that's pretty consistent from year to year, and we've done a lot of population monitoring where population breeding is fairly consistent from year to year. There's not a lot of change in individual and population level breeding dates from year to year, and there's certainly not changes associated with the timing of what some people refer to as the harvest moon. There's a promotion of that concept in certain articles and books, and we found no support for the harvest moon affecting time of breeding at the population level or the individual level from year to year.
Interesting. So moon phases, I guess there you go. You know, it's kind of like the conversation of what causes leaves to change their colors. What you're saying is essentially just the time of year, the amount of daytime or the amount of daylight versus nighttime and the way the days change, is that the internal clock that these animals are set up on, basically?
Yes, that summarizes it pretty well, and I might get Bronson to talk about some of his work he's led on our analysis of another point you made about the different buck ages and how they respond. I think you're right about the younger bucks maybe being a little more seen more before the actual population rutting period. But Bronson, how about if you talk about some of the body weight changes and associated with their actual involvement in breeding from throughout the hunting season?
Yeah, that was a pretty cool analysis that we just finished. And bottom line is, Todd, I think what you're observing, there is some merit to that, but I don't know if you would say that it's totally the rut. So in essence, these mature bucks continue to gain weight until basically the beginning of fall. And so when you plot their body weights over time by age class, you will notice that these older bucks will actually engage in what we would say rut behavior, even though they're not breeding, because does aren't in estrus yet, but they start losing weight quicker than younger bucks. And what we think, all we can do is look at the data and then try to form a biologically reasonable explanation for it. We think they are probably more engaged in territoriality and dominance, in fighting and defending territories and things like that. And then just naturally, even in a deer pen, becomes a certain time of year where these bucks just limit their food intake. They're just naturally not interested in eating. But we see a clear progression where these older mature bucks will start losing weight first, and these yearling bucks hardly lose any weight whatsoever. So they're still growing, they're still keeping their mind focused on, acquiring food when they can. They're really not in the reproduction game, so to speak. They're really not battling for dominance hierarchies or anything like that. Now, some of these crazy younger bucks that you might see running all over the place, I think there's a couple explanations for that. Number one is they're running all over the place to begin with, because more than likely a yearling buck, he just dispersed, from his natal range where mom was. And so he's trying to find his place in the world, moving around a lot. And then, he's probably in a new territory and smelling different scents of bucks and does and just, trying to determine what's going on. And probably the first whiff or even a hint, of a doe coming into estrus is probably driving him nuts. Whereas a mature buck, he's seen this for at least 3 or 4 or 5 years and kind of knows what the routine is. That would be my explanation, my attempt at an explanation for that younger buck activity. Another point, Todd, I wanted to bring up with your buddy there locally with the deer pen is, one thing in some previous research that we talked about in the last podcast about how rut timing and rut dates are maintained over time is a genetic link. And so, a daughter inherits that breeding time from her mother. And so that's passed on from female to female to female over time. And I don't know what the genetic composition is of that deer herd you were referring to, but it could be also because a lot of the females are closely related. And therefore you have that very distinct, within 2 days they're all in heat. Whereas in kind of a normal free-ranging population, I don't think you would ever see that stark of a change from no one being in heat to everybody being in heat. It's usually incrementally, a few start trickling in and coming into heat, and then you finally have that peak, for a week or two, and then it begins to decline.
Oh, and the great analogy or I guess connection that Sam's always been able to make is he hunts outside of his. He doesn't hunt inside the fence. He doesn't do hunts or anything like that. He just has them for his operation. But he's hunting wild animals at the same time. So it's always interesting to hear his perspectives. And he always jokes around about how if he wants to see whether it's a day he wants to hunt, he just looks out his window and sees if the deer are up feeding or not. And if they're not, they're laying down. He's like, all right, it's not a day I'm going to go out hunting. But he said there's quite a few similarities, and I'm sure not all of them, between a wild animal and a high fence animal, so to speak. But seems to be quite a bit of consistencies. It's always interesting to hear to talk to Sam about it anyway, because he lives with these animals, and he definitely is a whitetail mind, so to speak. But what we were just talking about as far as the bigger mature deer being more dominant, I see the exact same thing what you guys just talked about, which is that the older those deer get, they seem to really throw an anchor out, so to speak, in their home range. And that's their area they're going to defend. They want every other animal in that area to know that they are hanging out there. And here in Iowa, usually it means that they've got one bedding area in general, and then 2 or 3 different variety of food sources all close by. And that's what keeps the does there. They have their little harem, and that's where they want to set up shop, so to speak, which make them really tough to locate sometimes, which is going to get into one of my other questions I have. But also, from our standpoint, especially when you're bow hunting these big old deer, once you find that core area, it doesn't take a brain surgeon to kill them, but it's sometimes very difficult to get into that very, very small core area they call home. And they feel secure moving around during daylight. Because these deer don't just lay there, till dark every day. They're up feeding, browsing, but the areas that they do that in, I see just getting smaller and smaller and smaller as they get older. Until they hit around 7 or 8, and then it almost is like a switch where they start to get a little vulnerable again. They start to, I don't know if it's laziness or overconfidence, but that's actually when they become a little bit easier to target, I think, than some of your 5-year-old or 6-year-old deer. But right now, guys, continuing this discussion about the rut, one of the things that I'm always monitoring and watching on my own farm, and I find it fascinating every year, is that I kind of have like the nursery farm, and part of it's because my wife and I are pretty active here. It's pretty visible, and we're out on ATVs and stuff like that. But we watch a lot of young deer, a lot of does, a lot of fawns, and it's like a light switch right in the 20s of October, 22, 23, 24, 25. All of a sudden, the mature bucks will show up. I know what they're doing, but what date? I know each individual animal is a kind of a broad question, but I'm always fascinated with what makes them year after year just flip the switch on. Is it just built into their knowledge, or does it take some of that rut activity to get them, I guess, horned up enough to change their positioning? What's going on in their bodies to make them move? And when do you see that period as being an indicator? Is it just individual animals, or will it be like clockwork each year?
Well, let me ask you a question, but what's the month of peak breeding in your area?
The first 2 weeks of November.
Okay, so you see this increased buck activity leading into the peak of breeding.
Correct. It's usually here late October, the last few days of October, depending on weather. If we get that cold front in the 25th through the 30th or 31st, that's when the big ones seem to become vulnerable. They're going to go out and check the food plots. They're going to go out and check the scrape. But it always is that about, if I had to guess, 5 or 6 days before really any does come into estrus. I just didn't know that if that was a consistency, like a 5-6 day period when all of a sudden they'll move in before, or is it just vary on the individual animal?
Well, Bronson, why don't you mention the interesting behavioral work done at Kingsville by Dave Hewitt and his postdoc Aaron Foley about looking at how buck movements, and they have those focal areas that they traverse once breeding season happens, and that really is promoting their general movement.
Right. I was just thinking of that as well. Todd, the one thing I would say about the timing is what Steve was addressing there is, I think the trigger there is that you're 2 to 3 weeks prior to peak breeding. So you're in that latter stage of the pre-rut where my guess would be there's enough of in terms of their internal clock as well as external, sensory-wise, they know that it's about that time. They're probably, again, which is what some of this other research has shown, is that when the rut begins or before it begins, these bucks will start moving more and start basically, the way to explain it is they know where these groups of does hang out. And the more fragmented your landscape is in terms of cover, so think of a Midwest as more fragmented than, say, the piney woods of Mississippi. And so these bucks can figure out, hey, over in that patch of cover is that where that doe group hangs out, and over in that patch of cover. And so you would literally see on a 24-hour cycle, these bucks would go, and depending on the wind and the vantage point, they could basically go and assess whether or not there was a doe coming into heat just by, heat checking through their sense of smell. And it was literally clockwork. Every single day they would go around and check these 3, 4, 5 different groups of does within their home range. So behaviorally, I think that's what is going on. You're starting to pick up sightings of these bucks that you may not have seen because it's the time of year in the late pre-rut to where they know they need to start checking to see if there's some breeding opportunities.
And also, Todd, that population, that peak breeding for you, is a 2 to 3 week period, on another week on either side of that. So really, most breeding is within a 5 week period within a population. But you've got a few does coming in early. And so once that's happening, you may not think of it as peak rut yet, but there's still some potential breeding activity out there. And so these bucks start moving to their various focal areas within their home range where they'll go, and again, to clarify, the average buck that Foley's work showed had 3 focal areas within their home range, and they went to one focal area and spent about a day, and then a day later they moved to another focal area and spend about a day, and then move to their third focal area and spend about a day. So it's these movements between focal areas that allow you to pick up the movements of the older bucks. And then if you happen to be hunting in a focal area where they find an estrus doe, of course, then all bets are off. They're going to be following her and trying to tend her, and that's when you really see the bucks becoming more stupid, more available to be seen.
It's a tough time of year, too. I hear so many guys, especially back in the day, vacation days where you basically have to plan your season in advance to get your vacation for the working man, and you get your week off or 2 weeks off. And just living with these deer and hunting them year after year, the period of time I enjoy hunting the most is late October, and then toward the end of the rut. The middle of the rut's are really tough around here because we've got an incredible amount of great cover everywhere. So the deer are dispersed, they find their little core areas, and those big ones seem to go in those core areas, just like what you're talking about, and not move. They don't need to because there's enough deer to breed. They don't have to go very far for food. The other part, too, is, and I think this is the major factor on actual visual movement, seeing mature deer during the day, is the pressure. I've hunted farms in the same area here, just a few miles down the road, that just have the right ingredients where there's no pressure, there's tons of food, all managed, talking a couple thousand acres. And it's very common on those types of properties to see mature bucks during daylight going between those 2 or 3 core areas and checking them. Now, here in my neck of the woods, there's a lot of hunting pressure, and these mature bucks are used to being hunted. So you just don't see that daytime activity, which is why I concentrated on hunting right in those core areas, because that's where I can actually catch them. And I think for most guys across the U.S. who are hunting normal farms, they're dealing with pressure just like the rest of us, especially during bow hunting. And I think that's a huge part of success is you got to get closer to those core areas. But what you were just talking about as far as each buck generally has like 3, that's what I found here, about between 3 and 4 is usually, and it's in a lot of times a circular pattern. This stuff I could talk about all day long, man. It's awesome. Jason, do you have any questions or comments?
The great equalizer here is, I know it's biology and it's a relatively certain, it's a certain thing that deer are going to, because of photoperiodism, I believe is what it's called. They're going to come into estrus, and they're going to be bred for 2 days, I believe you guys said, correct?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
correct.
Anywhere from around 1 to 2 days.
1 to 2 days. And then as a population as a whole, and I'm just paraphrasing here, it takes place over a 5-week period, roughly.
Yes.
Okay.
That's right.
And a couple of questions that I have. I think I heard you resoundingly say, no, the moon has nothing to do with the rut. My question, I guess, about the moon is, have you guys done any studies where that suggests that the moon has anything to do with deer movement overall?
We have not.
Good question. We've done some analysis. Bronson, I'll remind you about Stephen Webb's analysis of some of our Oklahoma research, looking at GPS movements, and we did not find a pattern associated with the moon phase. I'm one of these biologists that have done a lot of night spotlight work for census, counting deer, as also collecting deer, and other biologists have done a lot of nighttime work. We tend to try to stay away from nights when there's a full moon, just because we tend to see less activity during nights associated with the full moon. Now, that goes contrary to what a lot of hunters say. Well, they don't see deer as much when there's a full moon, and so it's because they're out at night because there's more light, and so they're out feeding during the night. Well, that doesn't work biologically, because deer are adapted to see at night. They don't need a full moon to go out and feed. So I do think there's a moon, this is my opinion, there does appear to be a moon effect that we haven't fully quantified yet on deer movement rates.
Okay.
I know.
At night.
At night. Oh, as far as the nighttime movement.
Right, Steve.
I'm sorry.
My opinion, you need to qualify that by saying at night.
Yes.
From your observations, there is a difference in you seeing deer at night, but nothing associated with deer activity the following day.
No. This is nighttime, driving around properties at night. When do we see deer moving?
What about daytime movement? And I know where Jason's getting this from a little bit. Adam Hayes is a good friend of ours. I've known Adam for 20 years or something. And he's like a big buck machine killer. But I remember sharing camp with him back 10, 15 years ago, and he was using that moon guide back then and swore by it and said, time after time after time, you look at the activity times during the day, and sure enough, over a period of years, there's a correlation between it. I've never used one. He's generally the type of person who doesn't promote, which is why I like Adam. He doesn't promote stuff just to promote stuff. He's pretty much a true, honest outdoorsman and promoter. Mm-hmm. But do you know of any, have you done any studies of daytime movement based on these moon patterns?
I haven't evaluated. I don't think we've done that. Like Bronson said, we've really evaluated that kind of predictor. I have seen some efforts by other people looking at those predictors, and then, correct me if I'm wrong, Bronson, I don't remember anyone really concluding that those predictive tables and whatever actually are accurate. It's really easy to, look at that table, and if you tend to go out when it tells you to go out, and you go out and you see deer. It's easy to, then the table was right. But doesn't mean that if you went out another time you wouldn't have seen deer.
Especially when you're hunting these big bucks, if sitting on a field edge and expecting to see a buck come out in broad daylight versus moving in right to his core area and seeing him. There's so many variables it'd be difficult to do. I still believe Adam believes it and all that, and I know a bunch of other guys do. I just haven't. If anything, I was going to get one just to kind of just for curiosity's sake, see if I could create any correlations. But for what we've always hunted, myself and just hunting with a bunch of guys who are big buck killers and been hunting for a long, long time, weather is a bigger indicator than anything, especially when it comes to food. Like we've got a cold front coming in this week, and just over the years, early October, mid-October, the days where you will catch those big mature deer moving, it seems to have far more to do with the weather and these fronts and barometric pressure changes than anything really. But that's the thing about the rut too, though, guys. I mean, I've been hanging on the side of a tree in 80-degree weather in beginning of November, thinking, man, this is the worst. I'm never going to see anything, and have the biggest buck on the property chasing a doe out at 11:30 in the afternoon, in this heat. So that's the part I think we all love and hate about the rut, is that it's so unpredictable that it can't happen anytime. But for myself, where I'm hunting individual animals and using specific intel to try to figure out where they're at, I actually hate the first week of November. It's like the most difficult, challenging time for me to hunt here in Iowa. And a lot of guys, that's their favorite time because they see 50 deer a day. They see all the 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds running around like crazy looking for does. And so it's fun to hunt. But, I guess it just depends on what your goals are. And for me, I'm going after those big animals, and I'd rather have them be laying down in a bedding area than running around the neighborhood chasing and checking for does.
We did some work back in Oklahoma I referred to a minute ago, and our work there was looking at the effect of hunting season and hunting activity on buck movements, adult buck movement, and referred earlier about the older bucks going to ground. Part of the with understanding rut behavior is that it's overlain with hunting season activities as well, and both of those cause changes in buck movements and behavior. So in our study, we looked at it was a 3-week gun season in Oklahoma. We had no bow season was allowed. We just shut down the bow season hunt. We just looked at 3 weeks of their gun season on this property, and we controlled hunter access and assigned them to hunting areas so that we had really uniform hunting effort, and then we had other areas that we didn't have any hunting effort. So we're able to look at differences between hunted and unhunted, and we looked at also hunting weekend versus the second and third weekend, and we found some really valuable, interesting information. And opening weekend observation rates of our adult bucks were about 25%. So bucks that we knew were in areas being hunted, about 25% of them were seen. So hunters were seeing only 1 out of 4 bucks that were actually in their areas. And then the second and third weekends, those observation rates went down to 10%. So that's a huge drop from 25% observation rate opening weekend to 10%. So only seeing 1 out of 10 bucks that were present in the areas the hunters were hunting during the second and third weekend. And that's an indication of, maybe they were poor hunters. They just fell asleep the second and third weekends. But I don't think so. They were actively hunting, and they didn't see the bucks. And the reason I can tell you the reason is we had the GPS collars on the bucks, and we were studying what they were doing in response to the hunter presence. And their movement rates dropped 20%, which is a relatively small drop. But then their use of cover increased 5-fold, a 250% increase in cover. And so I think it was Jason was talking about liking to hunt, the cover. That's the key. When these bucks have been pressured from hunting season, even one opening weekend, and send them to heavier cover, a 5-fold increase in cover during the use of cover during the second and third weekends of the hunting season.
Well, I've got to tell you guys that, and I've talked about this several times. Last year, Todd, for the first time, took me out into his property just because time had finally dictated that we could do it, and he was explaining to me sort of his methodology of hunting and why he does what he does, and it sort of plays into what you're talking about. And I don't know how much you do and don't want me to say, Todd, so just stop me. I won't give anybody GPS coordinates, but one of the things that he said as we're walking down the hill, he said, I enjoy my farm all summer long. I'm not worried about spooking deer. I don't care if I spook deer. They're not being hunted. As soon as hunting turns on, I turn off the activity. I stay out of those areas. I don't go in those areas to check trail cameras. I don't mess with it, period. He said, I will guarantee you the first week in November when, the neighbors come in or whomever comes in from different sides, I will start to pick up pictures of, he was speaking about at that time a particular buck, and I just kind of rolled my eyes like, whatever, because I didn't know that much about deer, I guess, at that point, even though I'd been hunting a long time, and I just thought he was nuts, and that pretty much plays into exactly what your findings were. He's got a lot of cover, he's got a lot of thick cover, and I guess it all it makes perfect sense that they would gravitate to that area, because it sounds to me like what you're telling us, Steve, is that they're well aware that they're being hunted in a very short period of time. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And specifically to that question, guys, and this is the stuff that keeps me awake at night. And there's a lot that keeps him awake, believe me. Yeah, got that right. But I was just talking to Jason about it too. I said it's like taking a bucket of sudsy dish soap water and dropping oil into it and watching how everything will get away from that oil as quickly as possible, and it just boom, and all of a sudden creates a circle of impossible. You're not going to kill a deer in that area again. So I've tried to duplicate the one time in my whole season. So I've got 30 stands and I've got close to maybe 8 ground blinds or something. And I always like to recreate that first time in with every hunt. So every hunt I go on, I have a thick bedding area cover set that I can go into for the first time. Now, my question is in regard to this. I understand if you have a poorly educated hunter who goes in an area and rattles every 3 minutes and grunts and snort wheezes and lets the whole neighborhood know, hey, I'm a hunter. Makes a racket going in, banging, doing this stuff and everything else. I've reduced all of that down to a science where I only have ground scent going in, and I have been using different products to try to eliminate that. But as we all know, there's no certain way you can actually do that. So if I'm in a tree stand with an Ozonics going, any deer that comes downwind, they don't snort me necessarily. They are not smelling human. I'm so careful. But it seems like you put ground scent into a cover area where they're not used to smelling human once, and that's enough for some deer. Have you been able to measure any tolerance based on age or anything? And can you, again, I know there's so many variables, but to me, it's almost like as soon as that big buck smells that human scent in an area that he considers to be his core area or a safety zone, it freaks him out 10 times more than, and will affect their movements, their next movements far more dramatically than, let's say, if they smell your scent on a field edge that they're used to smelling humans. So, but is it just the ground scent they're smelling that freaks them out that bad?
That's a good question, Todd. We don't have a large enough sample size currently to tease that out. We have a new study going on right now here in Mississippi. We've got 48 adult bucks ranging from 3.5, a couple of 2-year-olds, but mostly 3 years through 7 years of age. And we're going to be studying them intensively for over the next 2 years, looking at how specific hunter activity affects their movements. So we hope to expand our knowledge base from the Oklahoma study, which was a very restricted 3-week gun season. Well, we have 4 months between bow season and primitive weapons and gun season, and followed with more primitive weapons October through January here. And so we're going to be following these bucks and their hunters over basically a 6-month period, very intensively. Every 15 minutes, we're going to get a location estimate on the buck, and we'll know when and where the hunters are hunting. And so we're going to try to answer that question a little bit better. But unfortunately, Tom, I have to wait until 2019 for that answer.
Okay. Well, the other part, or I guess one of the earlier questions, right when we started this podcast, I was going to ask you, and I think you just answered the question. It always seems like most of the deer studies, and guys like yourself, do most of your studies down south, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas. I hear a lot. And through David Morris, who is one of our business partners, I've had great conversations about him and Grant Woods, and back in when they first started doing some of the very earliest whitetail testing, and I think it was in Alabama, I think the Burnt Pine Plantation or something. But is that why most of the studies are done down south? You just have a larger sample period?
Well, I don't know if it's a longer hunting season. It's just there's a lot of interest here. But I don't know. That's a good question. I
think it's some of that, Steve, but I also think it's, most of those types of studies are funded by your state wildlife resource agency. And, a lot of that is based on what are the questions the state agency has. And so there's just been a lot of interest, I would say, in the South. And I think there's a lot of interest in the Midwest and North as well. And that really is a good question. And I don't know if it's more of a landscape issue or exactly what. But I guess I look back to what are some of the big questions that a state wildlife agency would have. And those are some of the things that they have funded.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense, and I think generally, if you look down in the southern states, hunting has been a more organized, a little bit more. There's been more money involved for a lot longer period of time. Where you come up into Iowa and Illinois, and really, deer have really only been managed popularly anyway for the last 10, 15 years. That's when everything kind of went crazy. So, I think the types of properties, I think maybe have a factor with it, but like you said, when it's state funded, it just depends where the money's coming from. But it's absolutely fascinating for me. I wouldn't mind having a few collars on a couple of the bucks I'm hunting, just to be able to monitor their movements. If there's any way we can help fund that.
All right, I'm envisioning a crowdsourced research project here.
Yeah, the only problem was I'd kill them halfway through the research.
You can't do that now, Todd. Now each collar is going to cost about $2,500. So can we put you down for 10 collars right now?
Holy cow! It would be it'd be pretty fascinating to be able to study that information. But Jason, do you have anything? I have an acorn related question, and
I do. I've got a bunch of stuff, and I'll try and keep it relatively short. Because the fact of the matter is we could probably sit here for the rest of the day and beat this horse. But a couple of things that I wrote down, and then I want to paraphrase them. In just simple yes or no questions are fine. Does the moon have anything to do with the rut or activity overall? I think both of you said, and again, I'm paraphrasing, there's not enough studies have been done to suggest one way or the other but in your opinion, no. Is that accurate?
I'll jump out there and give you my opinion. It's a big, emphatic no. And a lot of studies, guys, have been done, and no one finds an answer. No one ever finds this response, which is amazing to me. And this goes back into the days of before GPS collars with radio telemetry, which were, not as sensitive, and now in the age of GPS collars, where we can get, locations every 15 minutes, year after year after year, no one finds an effect. But this is one of those things to me. It is so embedded in lore, the hunting lore, that the moon is responsible for this, and for the life of me, I can't. I try to be really objective about this, and the way I think about it is, I've gone full circle, and I think, now why would the moon affect it? And I try to approach it from a different angle. Why in the world? So every single day, a buck is interested in varying amounts, depending on the time of the year, filling his belly and breeding. Now, why would the moon phase affect that? And so I'll just leave you with that question. And then all these studies, no one has ever shown that there's an effect. And we'll look at it again with the data that Steve was just talking about. We'll have a great 2-year data set here in Mississippi, and we will be sure to look at it again. But to date, no one has ever found a clear and consistent signal that the moon is affecting either the timing of the rut or deer activity.
Okay.
And I want to qualify, too. We did look at a large database of individual deer and population deer and showed no change or associated change with the moon, the timing of the full moon. And so I definitely, we have conclusive evidence that their moon phase, the timing of the harvest moon or the fall moon, not affecting timing of breeding at the population and at the individual level. Now, Bronson humors me sometimes and lets me talk about my personal opinion with spotlighting and deer behaviors, but I have to agree with him that there hasn't been of moon phase affecting behavioral activity, just movement rates of deer. We've argued over several various types of beverages about this topic, and he's right. There's not a good, clear evidence that it happened.
So we can cross the moon off the list. And again, I just want to sort of paraphrase everything that we've talked about. Roughly, a deer is going to get bred within 2 days. Those 2 days are dictated largely by photoperiodism. By and large, the population is bred in a geographical area over the course of 5 weeks. And that's really it. This conversation that constantly goes on about when should I take my vacation? Well, it's the same time every year. When you should take your vacation is, I guess, when you can take your vacation. So much of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, I just, again, paraphrase the rut from what we've talked about, but a lot of this is dictated by weather. In other words, what kind of weather you have is going to dictate the deer movement overall, no matter what time of year it is. So therefore, if you've got the right kind of weather, you'll have activity exposed, and you'll be able to see that activity. It doesn't mean that that's the reason, the weather or the moon or whatever, that's the reason that they're doing that. Is that an accurate statement?
I would even disagree with that, Jason. I don't even think that it's...
Well, that's hurtful.
I don't even think that it's largely dictated by the weather. I mean, I really don't. And again, it's just when you look at thousands and thousands, literally, of data points day by day, deer move every single day. They have to, unless you get in a situation extremely up north where, in terms of, thermodynamics and thermoregulation, where it's, it's energetically better for them not to move to conserve energy, but everywhere else, they're going to eat every single day. And when the rut is on, they're going to look for does every single day. Now, here's one thing I would qualify, not in terms of deer movement, but I would say in hunting strategy. Hunting strategy should be dictated by the weather in terms of wind. So touching back to what Todd said is, how often am I going to hunt? Well, I'm going to hunt every chance I get. I'm going to increase the odds that I'm going to see deer or see that buck I'm after. But I'm also going to be strategic about where I hunt based on the wind. So, yeah, indirectly it is affected by weather, but I don't think it's affecting the deer. It's affecting where I hope to intercept a deer.
Sure. Yeah, and just like when we went back, we were talking to Sam, it was the same thing. He's like, they come into estrus around the same time each year, and they go out of estrus. Depending on the daytime temperatures, it will dictate to a certain degree what animals you're going to see active during the day. Because if it's 95 degrees out, obviously the activity level is going to be down. But on those weather fronts, like, we're always hunting food generally. Like, if I have a big cold front coming in, bunch of weather, I'm not going in hunting a bedding area. I'm going and hunting the food. So that's like what you're talking about, is it allows you to strategize, because biologically, that's what that weather is doing to those animals, is making them want to go feed. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think you'd have to have some pretty severe swings. So, is a 10-degree difference that big of a deal to a buck to make him say, I'm going to go eat today, or I'm not? I personally don't think so. Now, in an area like yours, if it's November and it's 90 degrees, that's a pretty big deal. Sure. And then 2 days later, it's 30 degrees. I don't have the data to prove it, but I could see where that would have an impact. But on a lot of days, here in the South, where it may be 60 degrees and one day and 50 the next, I personally don't think that's a big enough of a swing in temperature to really stimulate a lot of movement. I think they're generation after generation. I think they're adapted to that type of climate, and every day they're going to eat.
For us, it almost seems like, and of course, I'm usually hunting particular buck bedding areas adjacent to these food sources and stuff, but just in the colder weather, it seems like they're more likely to get up a little early and go feed, and with a bow during legal light, 10 minutes makes all the difference in the world. But it can be random as well. But I think also a part of the reason is that colder weather, it moves the masses, so to speak. So if you can imagine a buck senses that there's 20 does out feeding this field, and it's around that time of year, well, that's going to drive him to that field probably more than the weather is.
I don't have any evidence, Todd, to say that you're correct, but I do agree with your logic. I don't have any data to prove that you're right, but at least philosophically, I support that.
Hey, I know one thing. I've never watched a mature buck starve to death because he didn't eat around here. But does dictate the hunt, man, and that's we get back to the basics during hunting season. If you're having a bad season or whatever, sometimes you just got to take a step back. If you're not seeing animals or not seeing the buck you're going after, I always go right back to where is the highest concentration of does. You go there, and sure enough, that's where the activity's at. So it's just common sense, but hey, we got to have something to talk about on these podcasts, right?
Yeah. Hey, this is Steve, and I want to kind of go through the whole control of breeding season. I think just to clarify, photoperiod. You mentioned photoperiod being the controlling factor, but it's just generally setting the clock. Deer are short day breeders, and so the photoperiod is telling them, it's coming into the breeding season, and it's time to turn on the physiology, the anatomy that starts generating the hormones that result in ovulation and the behavioral acts associated with breeding. So when an individual female is going to come into estrus is timed back for unique genetics, and that's why your friend, I think Sam, said the individual does tend to breed within a couple of days, the same date each year. But then also within an individual, her physiology and her nutritional status can affect exactly how that's expressed. In our research here in our deer facility, does that successfully reared 2 fawns and dealt with the added nutritional demands of lactating and bringing fawns to weaning, compared to does that lost their fawns early and didn't have that extra demand, there was about a 5-day difference in the breeding dates from year to year based on their reproductive success. And so those that had that extra nutritional demand of lactation tended to breed 5 days later than when they didn't have that demand. And so you get the photoperiod, the general timing, the individual genetics, the individual condition affecting the expression of that genetics, and then that population level breeding. That 5 weeks is a good generality about most of the breeding is going to take place. Now, within the adult does, that 5 week probably covers almost all of the adult does. They're going to come into estrus. Now, about 10% of them will not successfully take, and they may, the semen and the egg may not join together properly, or they may not implant. There's just about a 10% of those adult does are not going to take the first time, and so they're going to recycle. And so you'll have this rut of sorts about 3 to 4 weeks after the peak, that first peak rut. And those are does that are recycling because they didn't take. And then you also have fawns, and I think up in your neck of the woods, you have a pretty high percentage of fawns that are breeding. And those fawns are going to breed generally later than their adult does because it takes them longer to reach sexual maturity. So those fawn breeding events add to that second bump outside of the 5 week period. So just to clarify, you get that 5 week and then you get a secondary bump also.
One real quick question. We went through a heck of a drought here in southern Iowa this year. Have you noticed any correlation between your average breeding time of year versus what the previous summer, if there was bad drought conditions or maybe bad flooding? Will any of that affect your breeding times?
Drought can have two different ways. And now we haven't documented breeding success associated with drought per se, although there's been a lot of work in Texas looking at dry years having a much lower fawn recruitment, and there's a lot that goes into that general statement. But if you have a dry year, poor plant growth and lack of new plant growth, and so the quality of the forage is lower because there's not active plant growth, you could have a confounding effect. You could actually lower the nutritional condition of a doe and tend to have her enter or have her breeding dates delayed until she gets in better condition. But if that same drought caused her to lose her fawns earlier or to cause them to be lost, she may come into estrus earlier that year because she lost her fawns, which was tied to the drought. So the drought could delay an individual's breeding date if she successfully reared her fawns, or if it caused her to lose her fawns, it could bring her in early. So there's two different ways that drought mechanism could work.
Interesting.
And hopefully I didn't confuse the issue.
No, it makes sense on many levels. One of the things that you touched on, Steve or Bronson, I don't remember which one of you mentioned it, but we've all read the articles in all the different periodicals, and I've often wondered, well, where is it? Because we all hear about those fawns coming in November, or excuse me, in December, and I've just never seen it here in Wisconsin. And I don't know if that's largely a product of the rifle season taking so much out of the deer herd in terms of, basically making them nocturnal to an extent. But it sounds like you feel that there is a lot of fawn breeding. Just because it's a fawn, does that mean they're not going to get bred until December, or could they come into heat the 5th of November just like a doe?
Generally, it takes them longer. They have to reach sexual maturity, so they have to get a certain size, and then their hormones kick in, and it's generally going to be later. The way you document that is to look at lactation rate in your yearling does, each year. So if you have a 1.5-year-old doe and she's lactating, then she had to have been bred as a fawn.
And Jason, I would bet that it's occurring. Even here in Mississippi, from year to year, we have about 10% of the fawns that breed, and that's with our rut, being really late in the year, well into December here. And I think we mentioned on our podcast that a colleague of ours in Iowa, that there's up to 70% fawn breeding there.
Wow.
So
No way.
That's what surprised me, and that's what made me want to ask. I didn't know if Wisconsin was special, and well, it is special,
Yeah,
but
special in a lot of ways.
I know a bunch of Wisconsin guys who are special.
Right. Right. The last thing, and I think Todd has a question about Acorns, and I have a statement about Acorns. But to tie this in a nice little bow, I guess, if that's possible, with a topic like the rut, the bottom line is a lot of what you're going to see when you're in the timber hunting is still going to be dictated by pressure and weather. In my opinion, the deer are going to breed over a 5-week period. They're going to come into heat over a 5-week period. And when they do come into heat, it's going to be for 2 days. But again, I believe you both alluded to a study that that they conducted down in Oklahoma, where that activity is greatly reduced once they feel pressure. So the great equalizer here is it fair to say that it is pressure in terms of us going out and seeing deer during the rut? The pressure is going to affect it more than anything. Is that correct?
Well, our Oklahoma study was done toward pretty much after the rut. No, I'm sorry. It was before the rut. So it didn't coincide directly with the rut. So we couldn't, I can't directly say that that's true. I think we showed that pressure definitely affected the movement behavior of bucks. Now, when a doe is in estrus, he's living to breed. That's his job. And he's only eating because he needs to live to breed. And so there's nothing that's going to keep him from breeding a doe that tend. And, when that's happened, when he's tending a doe, he's going to be where the doe is. When and that 2-day period, there's a difference between in estrus and being in standing estrus, and it's the earlier part of that, the probably 24-hour period when she's in estrus. She's coming into estrus, but she's not in standing estrus, and so that's when the chasing activity takes place, and that's when you really are going to pick up the most movement by bucks that are tending a doe, because she doesn't want to be bred, so she's mostly trying to avoid the buck and he's staying with her. Now, once an individual gets into standing estrus, she will actually allow herself to be bred, and that's when the chasing stops. And it's probably not true for you two, Studley guys up north, but southern guys, you breed once, you kind of, well, it's time to relax and hang out a little. So that chasing behavior doesn't continue during the standing estrus of the individual doe. So further qualifying and rambling here. I'm sorry if that further confused the issue, but yeah, I'll stop.
And we're out.
No, that was some BS.
And that's it.
I have a real quick question. It doesn't need to be a real long explanation, but it's always something that I whenever I shoot a deer, I always cut open the stomach just to see what it's been feeding on. And what I've noticed over the years, especially since I've started doing food plots, is really when I started kind of paying attention to it. I would say on average here, I'm going to use the hunting season as a generality because I've never shot a deer during the summer to determine. But here, when I shoot an animal, no matter whether it's October 1st or December 1st, it seems like at least 50% of their stomach contents are green browse. The other mix is corn, ear, beans, and obviously acorns and things. But I'm always flabbergasted at how much green food is in their bellies, even when everything appears to be brown around you. In general, during hunting season, when we go through a change where they start to go more onto corn and or beans later in the season, or onto acorns this time of year, a really bitter food like acorns, I just ate one the other day because every year I like to eat the different foods just so I can kind of at least put my mind where they're at. But, I mean, you eat an acorn, and it's about the most dang bitter thing you ever eat in your whole life. And I'll sit and watch deer just pound them, one after another after another. Do they still follow that roughly? I guess, what is the correct percentage of browse versus grains? And when they start feeding acorns, what have you guys found? I mean, they're not going to sit and eat, 1,000 acorns a day and not browse. They're browsing, eating acorns, browsing, eating acorns. But is there a pretty consistent percentage of browse versus grains and or acorns that a deer will typically go through?
I'll throw out my input on that. This is Steve. Deer are herbivores, and they're going to eat green plant parts, the most digestible green plant parts that they can find. And when the green plant parts are available, that's what they're going to focus on. But soft mast, late summer, and then mast is a game changer because those are great energy sources that they're adapted to want to eat, especially when they're available. And so that's why they hit acorns so much. But you're absolutely right about the bitterness of acorns, and that's from the tannins that are in there. And tannins are a plant compound that plants produce to try to keep animals from eating them. And a lot of browse has, the leaves have high tannin content. And so browse tends to be less preferred than soft forbs, broad-leaved, non-woody plants.
Sure.
Forbs have less tannin, and so they tend to be most preferred, then followed by browse. Now, the mast, it's such a game changer because they need that energy source, and they're actually, deer are adapted to consume acorns. They have salivary compounds that bind the tannin so it doesn't negatively affect them like it would you. And cattle can eat acorns and die from the acorn poisoning because they're not adapted to eating acorns. Tannins are a pretty tough compound, as you found out, Todd, when you eat those acorns.
Oh, they're freaking terrible. I mean, I 2 years ago I was sitting watching a spike horn eat acorns for probably 45 minutes right below my stand. I was up on this ridge right below a creek. And I watched that stupid thing eat acorn after acorn after acorn. It went down to the creek, and I figured for surely he's going to have to get a drink after eating all those bitter things. And that sucker walked right across this creek, went back up into the green plots, and he never even paused to get a drink of water. And it just kind of was like, my God, they really do love those stupid things.
Just to show you how important energy can be later in the season, and of course, as Steve said, acorns or mast is, that. And when you said, Todd, when you said grains, so when you said you zip open the rumen and you see about half of it is green foliage or browse, and the other half would be a grain or be acorns. What a perfect diet for a deer that time of year. So there's a good balance of protein and carbohydrates in terms of energy. But as some researchers have shown in the past, is that as the season goes on and you can manipulate the diet, and so this would be like in a captive situation, is that if you free choice have the exact same feed and hold everything else constant, but you manipulate the protein amount and the energy amount as you get later and later into the season or into the calendar year and into January and February, those deer will start voluntarily choosing the feed that has lower protein and higher energy because they're typically expending, so much energy during that time of year.
It really is, until you really have your grain plots like beans and corn and some good plots. It's still fascinating to me, though, when we can shoot even late season. There's very little green food, and we can shoot one of these big bucks or a doe off of the actual corn plot or a bean plot or whatever. And when you open them up, you see just trace amounts of the corn and the beans, but still it's amazing. They really, really are an animal of constant movement, constant browse, kind of like cattle, I would imagine. And if you need any more reminder of that, just look at their neck length. I mean, that's how they're designed. They've evolved to be at the perfect height to be able to eat up, eat down, and eat everything in between. But I think that's the one piece of advice I can give anybody this hunting season is don't get too specific on a particular food source. They aren't going to sit there and eat for 4 hours. They're going to eat a little bit of corn, and then they're going to go right back to eating a little bit of everything else. And you'd probably do the same thing if you lived at the Wendy's buffet as well.
Good
Yeah, great point.
Well, guys, I don't know that we've completely covered the rut, but I don't know that you could ever completely cover the rut. I think that like I said, you're going to have that depending upon where you are in the States, you're going to have that 5-week period, and we all know based on where we live when that historically is. And Bronson, one of the things that I said earlier that I don't know that I said it properly was the rut's going to be the rut, and sometimes what exposes the rut, like people say, oh, it's a really good rut. Wow, this year's been, great. It's been crazy. Not like last year, though, the rut was really slow. I say that that's weather dependent, and that's kind of what I meant. So it's not an exact science, but I still think it's pressure and weather related in terms of how much activity you're going to see. No matter what, I think you guys have said from a biological standpoint, the activity is going to be there, period. Whether you see it, well, that's up to Mother Nature and the weather and pressure. And pressure does play a role.
Certainly plays a role.
I think half of the battle is, if you want to see 50 deer a day, go sit out on that food plot where you can see 500 to 1,000 yards across the field. You want to see movement? You want to see deer chasing deer around? There you go. You want to kill a big mature buck, get in the thick stuff, and you'll only see a deer or two. But it just depends on what your goals are, and that's why I think a lot of it, I don't see the movement I used to when I used to hunt the typical pinch points, corners of fields, funnels, the spots everybody hunts. Now I'm more focused on one individual buck, and generally in those core areas of those big mature deer, there's not a lot of immature deer that are going to want to be in that area because they know, this big old joker, he's got this taken care of, and I don't want to get my butt kicked. And so usually I think that's a huge difference in what you're seeing. And that's why I think so many guys want to sit on field edges is just so you can have that visual advantage, so you can see everything that's going on. But to me, I don't want to see everything that's going on. I want to, I'm hunting one individual animal. So you got to kind of decide what your goals are for the season. If you want lots of excitement, then set, more in open areas where you can see a long ways. If you want to have a better chance at killing a mature deer at close range, got to get in the thick stuff. That's just my closing thoughts.
Good thought.
Do you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I do.
I do.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go, boys. I want to thank you guys both for coming on our show. I enjoy these so much. I'm just a whitetail nut, and so anything I can get from a different perspective is always fascinating. So we appreciate your time very much and look forward to doing it again in the future, guys.
Happy to help anytime.
Yeah. Great talking with you all, Jason and Todd.
There you have it, our conversation with Steve Demarais and Bronson Strickland from the MSU Deer Lab. Don't forget to tune into their podcast, Deer University. It is, in fact, Deer University. It's got a lot of technical information from the biological standpoint of things. I don't think that they're going to get into a whole lot of hunting technique, etc., but there's certainly a lot of useful information, and I think you probably heard a lot of that useful information today. So if you get a chance, go ahead and subscribe to their podcast, give them a review. Also, don't forget to give us a review. And if you don't remember how to do a review or aren't sure how to do a review, just get in touch with me at jason@whiteknuckleproductions.com, and I will send you all the instructions that you could possibly ask for. Coming up in the next couple of weeks, you're going to absolutely love the guests that we have. One is a guest that we've had in the past, and it was a huge hit, and another is a guest that is going to absolutely blow you away. I'll leave that up to the imagination, but he was a guest at our film school a couple of years ago, and the room was absolutely dead silent the entire time he spoke. So I'll leave that up to your imagination. I hope you enjoy those podcasts that are coming up. Good luck to everyone who's out hunting. That's about all I've got for this week. Jason out.